Hi, I'm Linda from English Learning Mind Map. Today, we will learn about Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte. Historians often attempt to epitomize and transfigure Napoleon Bonaparte because his life does not remain a mere biography. It expands into an argument about ambition, power, modernity, and the dangerous seduction of greatness. Napoleon Bonaparte refers to the whole figure: soldier, ruler, lawgiver, exile, and legend. To epitomize is to represent something in its most complete and concentrated form, and he came to embody the extraordinary energies released by the French Revolution: mobility, merit, violence, and political reinvention. To transfigure suggests changing something so profoundly that it takes on a new and heightened meaning, and his career transformed personal advancement into a near-mythic drama that generations kept reinterpreting. He was never simply a man moving through events. He turned events into extensions of his will, and then turned memory itself into a battlefield. In him, calculation and imagination fused. He mastered artillery tables and administrative decrees, yet he also understood theater, symbols, uniforms, ceremonies, and the emotional appetite of nations. His triumphs promised order after chaos, while his excesses exposed how quickly order could harden into domination. This story begins before the crowns and campaigns in Corsica, where a proud provincial childhood first furnished the instincts that would later seek to command Europe. Corsican Origins. Corsican origins continued to anchor and imprint the young Napoleon long before he learned to command armies, because the island gave him both a place to stand and a wound to remember. Corsican origins refers to the formative world of family ambition, recent conquest, local resentment, and social precariousness that surrounded his early years. To anchor means to fix something firmly so it does not drift without direction, and Corsica gave him a stubborn sense of belonging, honor, and lineage. To imprint goes further. It suggests leaving a durable mark on character, and the island stamped him with pride, sensitivity to humiliation, and a restless drive to overcome perceived inferiority. He grew up in a society newly absorbed into French rule, where questions of loyalty were never entirely settled. That instability mattered. It taught him that identity could be political, strategic, and contested rather than serene or inherited without friction. He belonged, yet he also felt displaced. He was inside a system that remained faintly foreign. Such conditions sharpened his will. They made him vigilant, self-protective, and acutely responsive to status. Later, when he imposed order on vast territories, he was still, in a hidden way, reacting to the insecurity of beginnings. The island did not merely precede his career. It furnished the emotional grammar through which he interpreted advancement, authority, and insult. Ajaccio Childhood. Ajaccio Childhood allowed Napoleon to absorb and internalize the daily frictions of a proud provincial society, where memory, family strategy, and political transition were all woven into ordinary life. Ajaccio Childhood refers to his early years in the Corsican town where domestic routine existed beside larger questions of power, allegiance, and aspiration. To absorb means taking things in steadily through exposure, and he absorbed the sounds, resentments, loyalties, and practical calculations that shaped the atmosphere around him. To internalize means carrying those influences inward until they begin to guide instinctive response, and this environment taught him to convert pressure into determination rather than complaint. His family was neither destitute nor secure. It had enough standing to aspire, yet not enough certainty to relax. That combination proved formative. It encouraged vigilance and ambition at once. He watched adults weigh patronage, reputation, and opportunity, and he learned early that advancement rarely arrives by innocence alone. The town itself offered a small stage on which hierarchy was visible and emotion remained close to politics. He saw pride defended, slights remembered, and belonging negotiated. Those impressions later reappeared in larger form: his sensitivity to prestige, his need to dominate unstable situations, and his refusal to be diminished by first appearances. Before he mastered nations, he first learned, in miniature, how social worlds can reward calculation as much as courage. Island identity. Island identity taught Napoleon to synthesize and mediate competing allegiances because he belonged to a place whose loyalties were layered rather than simple. Island identity refers to the mental and emotional formation produced by Corsica's mixture of local patriotism, family ambition, and uneasy incorporation into French power. To synthesize means combining different elements into a coherent whole, and he gradually fused provincial pride with an expanding sense of personal destiny. To mediate means navigating between forces that do not naturally sit in harmony, and he learned to balance attachment to Corsica with the opportunities offered by France. This did not make him indecisive. On the contrary, it made him strategically supple. He discovered that identity could be rearranged without being entirely surrendered, and that a capable person might move between worlds by translating one language of loyalty into another. Such flexibility later became politically invaluable. He could speak as a patriot, a revolutionary, a ruler, or a restorer of order, depending on what the moment required. Yet the roots of that adaptability lay in an island condition, partial outsiderhood combined with fierce inward pride. He never entirely lost the sharpness that comes from being judged by accent, origin, and social position. The result was a temperament both defensive and inventive. He did not merely possess an identity. He learned to compose one, revise one, and deploy one as an instrument of ascent. Military education. Military education enabled Napoleon to cultivate and hone capacities that raw intelligence alone could never have converted into command. Military education refers to the sequence of schools in France where his mathematical aptitude, memory, and severity of purpose were directed toward the technical world of artillery and disciplined service. To cultivate suggests fostering growth by steady care and repeated effort, and his abilities developed through study, routine, and exposure to structured expectations. To hone means sharpening something until it gains precision, and these institutions refined his analytical judgment, especially his capacity to calculate under pressure and think in material terms about terrain, range, timing, and force. He was not naturally at ease in such settings. His background, accent, and reserve left him conspicuous, and social discomfort hardened into defiance. Yet exclusion became useful. Instead of seeking easy acceptance, he invested in competence. He read voraciously, submitted to rigorous schedules, and discovered that mastery could compensate for isolation. The military school was therefore more than a training ground. It was a mechanism of self-forging. It rewarded abstraction, endurance, and exactitude, qualities he would later magnify on a continental scale. Through drill, study, and institutional pressure, ambition acquired an operational form. He ceased to be merely a talented provincial youth and became a young officer capable of turning thought into organized action. Brienne Discipline. Brienne Discipline forced Napoleon to withstand and acclimate to an environment that was cold in more than climate, for it demanded endurance, hierarchy, and emotional containment. Brienne Discipline refers to the austere years at military school where he faced solitude, mockery, rigid routine, and the relentless shaping power of institution. To withstand means enduring hardship without being broken by it, and he learned to absorb social discomfort, homesickness, and disdain without surrendering his ambition. To acclimate means adjusting to conditions that first feel hostile or alien, and over time he adapted to strict schedules, competitive expectations, and the impersonality of formal training. This adaptation did not make him genial. It made him hard. He became more inward, more watchful, and more determined to derive authority from capability rather than charm. The school exposed him to rank and discipline not as abstractions, but as lived realities, teaching him that institutions reward those who master their internal logic. He also discovered the strategic uses of reserve. Silence could conceal vulnerability. Competence could reverse contempt. Those lessons remained with him. Later, when he expected soldiers and ministers alike to endure fatigue, precision, and pressure, he was extending habits forged in these adolescent trials. Brienne Discipline thus represents not only education but tempering, a process by which discomfort was converted into resilience, and resilience into a style of command that prized self-control above ease. Revolutionary rise. Revolutionary rise allowed Napoleon to ascend and commandeer amid national upheaval, because revolution shattered old barriers while rewarding speed, audacity, and decisive confidence. Revolutionary rise refers to the period when the collapse of established authority opened space for ambitious officers who could solve urgent military and political problems. To ascend means rising steadily toward greater rank or influence, and his rise was accelerated by a rare conjunction of talent and instability. To commandeer suggests seizing direction or control in a moment when hesitation would be fatal, and he repeatedly stepped into confusion with the confidence of someone who already imagined himself indispensable. The revolution created danger for everyone, but it also created permeability. Birth mattered less than usefulness. Reputation could be made rapidly if one delivered results. He understood this with unusual clarity. Rather than longing for a vanished order or surrendering to ideological chaos, he treated disorder as an opening through which merit, especially armed merit, might advance. His temperament suited the hour. He distrusted drift, despised paralysis, and believed that superior minds ought to govern events rather than submit to them. Yet this period was not pure opportunity. It also taught him how fragile legitimacy could be, how swiftly factions devoured one another, and how authority often depends on appearing stronger than the circumstances. He began not merely to participate in history, but to sense that history might be directed by those bold enough to grasp its reins. Siege of Toulon. Siege of Toulon allowed Napoleon to decisively intervene and distinguish himself in a crisis where tactical intelligence suddenly carried national consequence. Siege of Toulon refers to the 1793 operation against a strategically vital port held by royalists and supported by British naval power. To decisively intervene means stepping into a dangerous situation with measures that alter its outcome, and he did precisely that by recognizing which positions truly mattered and by concentrating force where it could have the greatest effect. To distinguish means setting oneself apart by exceptional performance, and Toulon became the occasion on which he ceased to be merely another young officer and became someone impossible for superiors to ignore. What mattered was not only bravery, but clarity. He saw that artillery, properly placed, could make the enemy's position untenable. This ability to reduce complexity to an actionable key became a signature of his command. The success at Toulon also showed that he thrived where urgency compressed time. Under pressure, his mind did not scatter, it sharpened. The episode revealed a style already fully visible in outline: rapid judgment, operational concentration, and disdain for half measures. After Toulon, advancement no longer depended simply on promise. It rested on demonstrated usefulness in the most public way possible. In revolutionary France, such usefulness could propel a man upward with astonishing velocity. Political notice. Political notice enabled Napoleon to captivate and legitimate influential observers, because military success only becomes durable power when it acquires recognition within the governing elite. Political notice refers to the moment when his name began circulating not merely in barracks, but in political circles that determined appointment, trust, and future opportunity. To captivate means drawing sustained attention through force of impression, and his success, confidence, and intellectual intensity made him difficult to dismiss. To legitimate means making something appear valid, credible, and acceptable within a wider system, and the acclaim following Toulon conferred on him the aura of a man whose advancement was justified by merit rather than accident. This mattered enormously. Revolutionary France was suspicious, unstable, and faction-ridden. Many rose quickly only to disappear just as fast. To survive, he needed more than victories. He needed a reputation that translated action into authority. He cultivated that transition with care. He wrote, argued, and positioned himself as a figure capable of serving the state rather than merely serving his own advancement. At the same time, others saw in him a useful instrument, energetic, disciplined, and effective in moments when the Republic desperately needed effectiveness. Political notice, therefore, marks the crossing from competence to visibility. It is the stage at which an officer's deeds begin to generate political capital, and where a career starts to acquire momentum beyond the battlefield itself. Italian campaign. Italian campaign allowed Napoleon to outflank and electrify on a scale that transformed him from a rising officer into Europe's most arresting military phenomenon. Italian campaign refers to the operations of 1796 to 1797, when he took command of a poorly supplied French army and used speed, maneuver, and concentration to defeat larger or better positioned enemies. To outflank means overcoming an opponent by striking where they are least prepared, and his campaign excelled in precisely that art, dividing adversaries, moving swiftly between them, and imposing tempo so relentlessly that their plans disintegrated. To electrify means producing an intense shock of excitement or astonishment, and victories in Italy sent that shock through France and across Europe. Soldiers saw a commander who seemed to make improbability routine. Politicians saw a national savior. Enemies saw a new kind of threat, restless, inventive, and devastatingly fast. The campaign also revealed his gift for theater. Bulletins, proclamations, and symbolic gestures converted battlefield success into public narrative. He did not merely win, he explained victory in ways that enlarged his own stature. Material hardship, numerical disadvantage, and uncertain logistics became backdrops against which his brilliance appeared even greater. The Italian campaign thus marks the moment when military ingenuity fused with self-conscious image-making. By then, his fame was no longer local or provisional. It had become continental. Continental Reputation. Continental Reputation helped Napoleon consolidate and radiate his fame beyond any single campaign, until victory itself seemed to travel in his wake as a personal attribute. Continental Reputation refers to the widening recognition that followed his Italian triumphs, when courts, newspapers, diplomats, and armies across Europe began to treat him as a central actor rather than a passing curiosity. To consolidate means making something more secure and durable, and he consolidated his standing by turning one sequence of victories into a pattern that appeared expressive of character rather than chance. To radiate suggests spreading outward from a powerful center, and his renown expanded through dispatches, rumors, negotiations, and the anxiety of governments forced to reckon with him. Reputation, however, was not passive. He shaped it deliberately. He understood that fear, admiration, and expectation can become strategic resources long before a battle begins. When opponents believe they face a commander of singular energy, they often start adjusting too soon or too nervously. His image, therefore, acquired operational value. Yet Continental Reputation also enlarged his political possibilities. Fame detached him from strict dependence on patrons and made him, increasingly, a power in his own right. France possessed a general. Europe was beginning to witness a phenomenon. Once that distinction emerged, the question was no longer whether he would matter in politics, but how fully he would try to absorb politics into his own command. Imperial Zenith. Imperial Zenith saw Napoleon concentrate and redefine power until France itself seemed reorganized around his will, and Europe confronted not a revolutionary officer, but a sovereign architect of order. Imperial Zenith refers to the period in which his authority reached its fullest extent, combining statecraft, military command, ceremony, and institutional transformation. To concentrate means gathering dispersed elements into a single commanding center, and he concentrated decision-making, prestige, and initiative in his own hands with extraordinary thoroughness. To redefine means altering the terms by which something is understood, and he redefined rulership by fusing revolutionary legitimacy, administrative efficiency, and monarchical symbolism into a novel form of domination. This was not mere vanity, though vanity was present. It was also a political solution. After years of instability, many in France wanted security, coherence, and predictability. He supplied them, but at a price. Liberty narrowed as order intensified. Under him, the state became more legible, more disciplined, and vastly more effective. Taxation, law, appointment, policing, and military mobilization all moved with greater clarity from center to periphery. Yet his success bred an even larger ambition. Once authority had been assembled so completely, it seemed to invite expansion. If he could reorder France, why not reorder Europe? Imperial Zenith therefore embodies both accomplishment and temptation, the moment when constructive power and imperial appetite became inseparable. Consular Power. Consular power enabled Napoleon to stabilize and centralize France after years of revolutionary convulsion, presenting mastery not as chaos's continuation but as its cure. Consular power refers to the governing phase after the coup of 1799, when he emerged as first consul and began refashioning the state in a more coherent and disciplined form. To stabilize means making conditions secure, predictable, and less vulnerable to collapse, and he stabilized finances, administration, and public authority sufficiently to convince many French citizens that durable order had returned. To centralize means drawing control toward a single governing core, and he steadily placed key functions, appointments, policy, policing, and implementation under tight supervision from above. This administrative concentration suited his temperament perfectly. He distrusted fragmentation and believed that a state should move like a well-drilled army, informed, hierarchical, and responsive. Stability, however, was never neutral. It increased his prestige while reducing the independence of institutions that might have checked him. Still, the appeal was undeniable. Roads functioned, offices answered, taxes arrived, and policy ceased to dissolve into factional improvisation. Many accepted narrowed political freedom in exchange for effectiveness. Consular power, therefore, marks the phase when conquest of disorder became conquest of government itself. He was no longer merely exploiting turbulence. He was mastering the machinery that made a nation governable. Administrative codification. Administrative codification allowed Napoleon to codify and rationalize the structures of government so thoroughly that his influence outlasted many of his victories. Administrative codification refers to the legal and institutional reforms associated with his rule, above all the civil code, but also the reorganization of education, administration, taxation, and public authority. To codify means arranging rules into an ordered and authoritative system, and he did exactly that by converting scattered legal practices into a more coherent body of law. To rationalize means redesigning something according to logic, efficiency, and consistency, and his reforms aimed to make administration less arbitrary and more intelligible from the center outward. This aspect of his career deserves special weight because it reveals a mind not confined to battle. He was not satisfied with dramatic conquest alone. He wanted lasting structure. Prefects, lycées, bureaucratic order, meritocratic advancement, and legal clarity all belonged to that ambition. Of course, rationalization also served control. A more orderly state is easier to direct, inspect, and command. Yet the durability of these reforms shows that his constructive energies were real as well as self-serving. Even those who rejected his imperial wars could not ignore the administrative legacy he left behind. Administrative codification, therefore, represents the side of his rule that entered everyday life most deeply, shaping institutions long after banners fell and battlefields went silent. Imperial expansion. Imperial expansion enabled Napoleon to subjugate and orchestrate vast territories, pushing French predominance across the continent through a blend of military force, dynastic placement, and strategic redesign. Imperial expansion refers to the phase when victory no longer served simply to defend France, but to reorder Europe according to his calculations. To subjugate means bringing peoples or states under one's domination, and he repeatedly compelled rivals, satellites, and defeated monarchies to accept arrangements favorable to his system. To orchestrate suggests coordinating many elements into a directed whole, and he treated alliances, kingdoms, logistics, law, and warfare as interlocking parts of a grand design. His empire was not merely territorial. It was administrative, diplomatic, and symbolic. Brothers became kings, boundaries shifted, and old political forms were made to serve new purposes. To admirers, this looked like modern reorganization sweeping away decay. To enemies, it was naked hegemony draped in reforming language. Both perceptions contained truth. He spread certain institutional principles while also extracting loyalty, manpower, and compliance on a scale that bred resistance. The more extensive his system became, the more difficult it was to sustain. Yet, during these years, the sheer coherence of his ambition astonished contemporaries. He appeared capable not simply of defeating coalitions, but of compelling the continent to inhabit a political order shaped from his own strategic imagination. Austerlitz mastery. Austerlitz's mastery allowed Napoleon to outwit and annihilate his opponents in a battle so consummately arranged that it became the paradigm of his battlefield genius. Austerlitz's mastery refers to the victory of December 1805, when he defeated the combined Austro-Russian forces through deception, timing, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy error. To outwit means prevailing by superior intelligence and anticipation, and he did so by inviting the Allies toward what looked like weakness, then striking the moment their balance had been fatally compromised. To annihilate means destroying an opponent's effective capacity to resist, and although the enemy armies were not obliterated to the last man, their cohesion, plans, and confidence were shattered with extraordinary completeness. The brilliance of the battle lay not only in courage or force, but in composition. He made terrain, timing, morale, and illusion cooperate. What the enemy believed they were seizing turned into the mechanism of their undoing. Austerlitz confirmed his reputation at its highest level because it displayed command as an art of total understanding. He saw the field not as a chaos of collisions, but as a structure to be manipulated. Yet, such mastery also intensified the conviction that he could continue imposing his will on Europe indefinitely. Great victories often conceal the seeds of future excess because they make limitations seem almost irrelevant. Exile and memory. Exile and memory showed how Napoleon could endure and haunt even after defeat, because his removal from power did not remove him from Europe's imagination. Exile and memory refers to the final phase of his life and the long afterlife that followed it, when military collapse gave way to banishment, reflection, and the construction of legend. To endure means continuing despite loss, distance, or ruin, and he endured physically through enforced isolation, but also symbolically through the persistence of his name in political and cultural discourse. To haunt suggests remaining present in unsettling, recurring form, and Europe could not easily free itself from him. He had altered borders, institutions, and ambitions too profoundly. Even those who detested him kept measuring events against his example. Defeat, therefore, did not produce silence. It produced transformation. The conqueror became the exile. The ruler became the narrator of his own fate. The defeated emperor became a figure available for myth, pity, resentment, admiration, and warning. That complexity explains why memory clung to him so fiercely. He could signify modern merit, tyrannical appetite, heroic resolve, or catastrophic overreach depending on the observer. Exile and memory thus forms the final paradox of his story. The body was confined, yet the image became more mobile than ever, traveling through politics, literature, and national self-understanding long after the empire had fallen. Catastrophic reversal. Catastrophic reversal revealed what happens when power begins to overreach and then collapse under the accumulated weight of its own scale. Catastrophic reversal refers to the chain of disasters above all the Russian campaign, mounting resistance, and the eventual defeats that dismantled Napoleon's imperial system. To overreach means extending oneself beyond sustainable limits, and his ambitions had grown so vast that success in one theater increasingly depended on coercion and control in many others. To collapse means falling apart decisively after strain can no longer be borne, and that is what overtook the empire once military losses, logistical exhaustion, and political resistance converged. The catastrophe was not caused by a single mistake alone, though mistakes were immense. It emerged from structural excess. He had built an order whose effectiveness relied too heavily on his own momentum and on the continued fear of his enemies. When those conditions weakened, fragility appeared. The Russian disaster did more than destroy troops. It punctured inevitability. After that, allies recalculated, subjects resisted more openly, and enemies sensed that perseverance might finally prevail. Catastrophic reversal, therefore, marks the moment when greatness turned against itself. The very qualities that had built supremacy, audacity, speed, confidence in decisive action, now pushed him toward choices whose consequences could not be mastered by brilliance alone. St. Helena Reflection. St. Helena Reflection compelled Napoleon to recast and brood upon his life in a setting where action had ended but interpretation remained possible. St. Helena Reflection refers to the years of exile on the remote Atlantic island where he lived under surveillance, separated from power and increasingly engaged in shaping the story posterity would inherit. To recast means presenting something again in a newly arranged form, and he tirelessly recast his career as the work of a misunderstood titan, a lawgiver betrayed by lesser men and crushed by hostile coalitions. To brood means dwelling darkly and persistently on loss, grievance, or destiny, and exile gave him abundant time for precisely that inward labor. This stage matters because it shows that he did not relinquish command entirely. He shifted it from armies to narrative. Conversation, memoir, recollection, and self-explanation became instruments through which he sought to govern memory as once he had governed states. Isolation intensified both vanity and insight. He could be evasive, self-justifying, and theatrical, yet he could also be piercingly lucid about human ambition, fear, and power. St. Helena Reflection therefore represents a second campaign, waged not with canon but with interpretation. He understood that history is not secured only by deeds. It must also be narrated, framed, and emotionally charged if it is to survive defeat. Posthumous myth. Posthumous myth enabled later generations to mythologize and resurrect Napoleon long after his death, because disappearance from life often magnified what had once been divisive in the moment. Posthumous myth refers to the legend that grew around him through memoirs, ceremonies, political appropriation, literature, and public fascination in the 19th century and beyond. To mythologize means turning a historical figure into a larger symbolic presence, and that is exactly what happened as memory softened details, amplified drama, and selected qualities suitable for admiration or denunciation. To resurrect means bringing back into active presence what seemed gone, and his image was repeatedly resurrected whenever Europe reconsidered leadership, revolution, national glory, or the burdens of modern state power. The myth was never singular. Some saw a liberator of talent and destroyer of stale privilege. Others saw a war maker whose appetite consumed millions. Yet both hostile and sympathetic readings helped sustain the legend. He remained useful because he was interpretable. His life contained enough splendor and ruin to satisfy opposing political desires. Posthumous myth thus demonstrates how historical magnitude can become culturally self-renewing. Once a figure embodies too many aspirations and anxieties at once, he ceases to belong wholly to the past. He becomes a recurring language through which later ages discuss themselves. European imagination. European imagination allowed Napoleon to permeate and polarize the continent's memory until he existed not only in archives, but in novels, paintings, speeches, and political dreams. European imagination refers to the broad cultural afterlife in which his image circulated across Europe as a figure alternately admired, feared, envied, and condemned. To permeate means spreading through something so thoroughly that it becomes difficult to isolate or remove, and his presence permeated 19th century thought because he touched war, law, merit, empire, nationhood, and the spectacle of individual will. To polarize means dividing opinion into opposing camps, and few figures did so more completely. For some, he was heroic energy in human form, proof that genius could rise above birth and reorder a stagnant world. For others, he was the supreme warning against intoxication by power and the cult of the exceptional man. That division helped preserve his vitality. Consensus often dulls memory, conflict keeps it alive. European imagination, therefore, marks the final extension of his story. The man who once crossed mountain passes and battlefields now crossed genres and ideologies. He became a mirror in which societies examined their own desires for order, grandeur, freedom, and command. In that sense, his last empire was immaterial yet immense, an empire of symbols, arguments, and enduring fascination. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more English lessons.